let's bring in Brian Friend and Lauren Khalil now, because we want to talk about something that we touched on last week. And Dave Castro addressed this week in sort of his weekly thing that he does on his YouTube channel, where he just, he answers some questions and gives an update on things that are going on. And I don't think I think people have been paying more attention to that now, given the role that he's in, as opposed to before, when he was just sort of the affiliate liaison. I don't know if that was his official title, but that's essentially the role that he was in. And there was there's some good stuff that he talked about that in that video. I think it's about 15 minutes long, maybe, if that.
Longer than that. It's like 22 minutes, which is
it is 22 minutes. You're right.
Most of his stuff is. Yeah.
Yeah, and he dedicates about half of it, I would say, to dealing with the cuts and giving an explanation for that.
But almost all of it is related to CrossFit, and he started doing those before he was back with CrossFit at all. It used to just be updates in his life and shooting competitions he was doing and whatever else, and it's kind of transitioned more and more to being pretty CrossFit heavy. Yeah, and a couple. So the quick things that I wrote down, or I took notes as I was listening to it. Someone asked him about going international with the CrossFit Games. That's been a hot topic for a long time. People have asked us about it. He said it's hopefully rather sooner than later, but not next year or the year after, but thinks that they should do it. Talked about mostly staying away from the CrossFit Games. And, jump in here, anybody, if you want to add something to this. I know Brian. Well, that thing about the international competition is interesting, because as far as I'm aware, next year is known. The year after that is unknown. And if he's only saying there's a 2-year window, what does he know about 2 years from now that we don't know? And is there a possibility for a short-term stop somewhere before a big change, potentially international?
Yeah, good question.
Sooner rather than later, I believe, was the terminology he used on trying to go international. So I think that everyone got everyone thinking about
it's happening.
Maybe a little European vacation.
Yeah.
Right.
Mine expires.
Make sure they're going to be updated.
Thank you for the reminder.
Yeah.
Mine expires in September. I got to go.
That means it's already expired, Sean.
What? It's July.
You can't travel with it 6 months before it actually expires.
Well, then why give me an expiration date?
Wow.
I have no idea.
This is Sean's origin story right now.
All right.
His villain origin story.
Well, what sense does that make? Then give me the right expiration date.
Yes. It makes zero sense, but also it's perfect
I don't get it
for
either.
you to have as a way to just, what grinds my gears? We just Sean just got a no rep right
Someone just added a no rep to his repertoire for the end of the show. Anyway, I'll get on that. Thank you, Brian. Another thing he talked about is he didn't have any interest in bringing the Invitational back. He said he doesn't want to go back because that's an old property. He'd rather look at something new and exciting and different. And this goes back to sort of our rationale when we didn't run the Justin Berg interview, because Justin specifically in that interview talked about bringing the Invitational back. Mm-hmm. And, that just shows you how things change.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting. Go ahead, Brian.
Go ahead, Tommy.
Tommy first, then Brian.
I think, okay.
Well, I was going to say this is more this is more of a joke, but he mentioned not doing something just because we did it before. His first justification for cuts was doing it because there was laying out the historical thing of the cuts. I realize it's not one-to-one, and he definitely backs it up more, but I just found that interesting. But he did say, if adding something, it would be something new and exciting too.
Yeah.
So I don't think that was entirely different from what Justin maybe proposed.
True.
I think he may have thought of it under the invitational framework, but maybe something new and reworked.
That's a good point.
So I do think that there is still some potential tie-ins on both sides, I guess.
Right. Yeah, because Dave's verbiage was that he doesn't want to recycle and do something that was old. So I think that there's legs for a invitational type thing, but he would want it to be refreshed is what I took away from it.
Yeah, agreed.
And I think it was you, Sean, who talked about it when we spoke about it, is that, the landscape internationally has changed quite a bit, and there might be an opportunity for different teams, new teams, or a different format within that same concept of, having some different parts of the world represented. So I wouldn't necessarily be, quick to rule out the possibility of something similar, but I think the exact thing coming back, he made it pretty clear that he doesn't have an interest in that.
Yes. He also talked about the whole grip controversy, and he owned that. He's like, we messed that up, and then clarified the thing. It's like, we're going to measure it. You can't go past your longest finger. Doesn't matter what happens when you get on the bar. Simple. So that was good.
Yeah. I mean,
thank God.
Yeah. seriously. Also, and this is maybe a preview for Lawrence Death by, I think someone on the panel volunteered maybe to just go around and start cutting people's grips. So
James Hobart said that he's going to have scissors and go back in the corral and be cutting grips if they're too long.
I have images of James Hobart dressed like Brutus the Barber Beefcake with his gigantic shears, just like running around backstage and chopping grips. That'd be great. So that was the other stuff other than the cuts that I wrote down that I thought was noteworthy.
Let's see. There was one thing that I wish he would have expanded on further. So maybe just I might drop it in the comments. He mentioned a conversation with the PFAA, but didn't really dive into what that conversation revolved around outside of maybe just mentioning the cuts. And it sounded like he was maybe going to go into like what the exchange was around the cuts and their reaction. But then I think he started to dive into a different point. But I don't know. I would have liked to learn a little bit more about that dynamic.
Yeah, agreed. Brian, anything I missed?
That dynamic is something that Justin Berg was also pretty consistent about, informing the community over the last year or so, is that conversations are regularly being had with, I thought this was actually super funny, with stakeholders, and Dave felt necessary to mention that he hates that word, even though he chose to use it. And obviously the athletes are a stakeholder in the community, and it feels like Dave has some intention, at least, of continuing the conversations with them in the continued pursuit of finding some ways throughout the season to make sure that those voices are being heard and that things are being done to accommodate some of the large or big picture things that athletes are looking for from CrossFit.
Well, let's get to the cuts, because like I said, he spent about half of this video talking about that. He started by saying, cuts are controversial. They're not that popular. Doesn't mean it's not the right direction to go. And he said he's not in the role that he is in to make popularity points. He's in this role to drive the sport forward. So that was sort of his preamble. And saying that the hardest decisions are most unpopular. And then proceeded to sort of give a history of what the games have looked like with and without cuts, what the inspiration was behind them, why they started them, and things like that. So
his history lesson was faulty, though. And I actually talked to him after the fact, and there was a 4-year period of time where there were no cuts, 4 consecutive years, from 2015 to 2018. From 2009 to 14 there were, and every year since then there has been. And this is something that's always kind of made me kind of chuckle to myself about Dave, is he has this incredible ability to be so heavily invested and passionate about something, but then when he moves on from it, he almost forgets it. And he just becomes so heavily and passionately invested in the next thing, even if it's just the next season or the next year. And he was like, he didn't even remember that there were 4 consecutive years of cuts. That was not a thing. And so when he gave that history lesson, he kind of skipped over that part, which I think it would be, interesting to ask him. He might not know or have any recollection of why he made that decision 4 years in a row to have no cuts, but there was, and it that became the norm. And I think that at some point, what we're going to arrive on in this conversation is, I think that's what people really want, is they just want something that's consistent year to year. They don't really care if there's cuts or not, as long as we know what's happening.
Yeah. Well, and to build on that, Brian, because I was probably had the same reaction as you did when he mentioned this, there may have been a year or two that, and I was like, no, there's 4 years in a row. After you made the adjustments of what a lot of people consider super regionals in 2015, once you made the qualifying stages much more difficult, you eliminated cuts at the games. And this is take with it what you will. Those are 4 years that a lot of people see as some of the pinnacle of the sport in terms of the test, in terms of the execution of the season, in terms of, what was being built for the sport and the momentum around the professionalization of it as a whole, including, and this touches to one point that he brought up around it opening up the playbook. I feel like one of the hallmarks of those years was Dave and the team's ability to really expand the playbook beyond what we had seen. Some of that was a new venue as well, despite having a full field of 40.
Mm-hmm.
So it was interesting that, like, I would have loved to, and we have an ongoing request for him to come on when he has time, but I would love to have that conversation with him, because I think there is a little bit of, like, I don't say pushback, but I want to learn more about that process and maybe, jumble some of that memory and maybe get some insight onto those things, because it does seem very heavily focused towards the years that we did have cuts.
All right. He after his history lesson, even if it was a little faulty, he did get into some rationale for them. And this is where I was like, okay, there's some very good points being made here that I did not think of when I said I don't like cuts. I still don't like cuts. I don't. But I understand them a lot better. And I get why they're doing them here. He said these cuts were communicated earlier enough that they are appropriate and incredibly fair. You get 2 days of competition, then we get our first cuts. And usually there are 3 events per day on average. So with 2 days, that's a semifinals worth of events that you're going to get before we cut down the field the first time. Okay, fair enough. He also,
are people signing up for a second semifinals, or are they signing up for the games? That's where, like, he lost me.
Well, yes, and I want to get to that in a second, because I think that's a really good point. But he also said that, look, if we have, cutting down the field gives our fans, our judges, our staff a chance to unplug and go and, rest up and put their full attention towards, every single heat of every single event. It also is beneficial for our vendors, because we don't have nonstop competition. So people will go into Vendor Village, they'll hang around, they'll spend money. Like, I get all of that. And then from a broadcast standpoint as well, you're not showing 4 heats, you're showing 3 and then eventually 2. So it's a lot easier to hold people's attention and not have like a 9 to 5 day of competition. Sympathetic to all of that. And then, you mentioned getting creative with programming. He mentioned specifically the event that they did in 2021 with the lifting event, in 2019 with the lifting event, stuff like that with the cuts. Like, he really liked that. And Brian, I think you've made this point. It's like, yeah, you could still do that without cutting anybody. It just looks a little bit different. So end of the day, like, I have a better understanding of why they did it. I still don't like it. And my solution is, look, if you're worried about the field at the games being too big and being prohibitive for an enjoyable in-person experience and an enjoyable broadcast experience, just take fewer people to the games, make it a field of 20 and go the whole weekend with that.
I think there's a lot of merit to an idea like that, because all of the stuff that he said, first of all, I think is very appreciated by the community. As soon as that podcast or post or whatever it is went out, I listened to it and I reposted it on my Instagram and said, this is a must listen if you like the CrossFit Games. And the response I got was pretty unanimous. And it was, more or less something along the line of, I'm still not a fan of the cuts, but I'm happy that there's at least some kind of explanation or some version of this. I think that what has become quite apparent over basically since 2019 is that when the cuts are in play, there are certain things that are very, very difficult from a programming and scoring perspective to avoid, that create some kind of skew to the test that I don't think sits well with people. And I think that's where most people get hung up.
Yeah. And and then building off of that is, where does the balance exist between wanting to create a higher quality fan experience, a higher quality vendor experience, a higher quality volunteer and staff experience, and the I don't want to say the validity, but like the claim of fittest on earth and the execution of a test that supports that, right? Because this was something that was driven home at length for us for years. Hey, what comes first and foremost is crowning and giving out an appropriate title of the fittest on earth. Yeah. That is the number one focus, the modus operandi of the CrossFit Games and the sport as a whole. everything else comes secondary to that. And you're like, okay. And now granted, within that, you can still make allowances and have room for space for those other things. But I think this is where I think maybe a potential growth point is, where we can have conversations with people like Dave now that we can ask those questions and get more insight. Because I think that's the value, right? The value is the insight into the process, into the justification, into the decision making. And I think you can add further value if that insight is given through a conversation, a two-way conversation, which I think is something that I would love to see built upon going forward.
Yeah. And Lauren, you brought up people, are you signing up for semifinals or are you signing up for the games? And that's where, I agree with your point. It's like, I'm okay with, and Dave mentioned this, that other sports have this in place.
Yeah.
And my argument is, yes, they do. They absolutely do. Like in a team sport, you go regular season, playoffs, championship, and that field gets smaller as you go, but you never cut in the middle of a competition.
Exactly.
It's like if the team is down at halftime, you don't cut them from the game.
Or you could parallel this with, I think a lot of people look at golf and they're like, well, in a golf competition, the competition starts with this many people, and at the halfway point, it goes to this many people. But there's two things about that are totally different than the CrossFit Games. One is that's known and it's been established for a very, very long time, and it's predictable. Number two is they have another chance the next weekend. The CrossFit Games is something that athletes train for 5 to 10 years sometimes as a dream and a hope and a pursuit. And I'm at the HWPO headquarters right now. Jake Douglas is here from Australia. This guy has been chasing this for a long time, 6-7 years. He's been in this sport. He's finally made it. And when he qualifies for the CrossFit Games down in Australia, his whole life changes for the next 3 months. He's got to now change his training completely to prepare for a totally different style of test. He has to think about his business, his regular life, his family life. He has to come over. He's come over 5 or 6 weeks early because he's almost 2 weeks in and he's still acclimating to the time zone, different kinds of eating environments, all these things, because this is something he's been chasing for years. And when he goes there, he doesn't want to waste the opportunity. He wants to give himself the best chance. And I think that it's more than fair from the athlete's perspective to have the chance to take the whole test. And I would have to push back on Dave when he lays out this fairness thing and say that I don't think he's really appreciating what it is fair when you think about how much it takes and what kind of commitment it is from the athletes just to get there, and that to have that opportunity kind of cut in half, cut short when they've traveled so far, worked so hard, put so many things on hold to be able to have this chance possibly once.
What's interesting is
it's not even
go ahead, Lauren.
Go ahead, Lauren.
For me, it's not even about what's fair and what's not fair, because at the end of the day, this is sport, and a lot of the times it's not fair. We're going to get
if he's choosing to use that word is all I'm saying.
No, yeah. I'm just saying that, like, for me, that's not even, like, when I'm looking at cuts, it's not about fairness and while these athletes have worked so hard, because I think you can make a very similar argument for a lot of the athletes that we saw at semifinals that worked so hard to get to that stage and maybe are still trying to chip away to eventually get to the games. But for me, it's just like the season format keeps changing. Everything keeps changing. We're looking for something of consistency, and the fact that, yes, we were given this a month ahead of time, but why isn't this laid out in the rule book at the very beginning of the season? Decide whether you're doing cuts or not and just leave it to be that. I personally don't like cuts. I want to watch every single heat at the CrossFit Games because these are the best of the best. I'm not picking and choosing which heats to watch. Yes, obviously the final heat with the Tias and the Justins, you're a little bit more amped up about because there's more on the line, but I want to see all of the athletes. So from a viewership, I mean, I don't know if they have specific numbers that, like, people aren't interested in watching all of the heats or what, but I think that's what makes it so special, is that it's an entire week full of competition from essentially, well, this year, it's cut down a little bit differently, but I want a full week of competition. That's what I'm looking for, because we only have it once out of the year.
Well, two things to touch on that. When you said you don't know if they have the information around whether or not people are watching, I think it would be hard to say one way or the other, given the lack of consistency over the last 5 years. How could you reasonably put together consistent data across the board and of those types of habits if you're tweaking and changing something, everything year to year. And that's not, and then with COVID and everything like that, that's not necessarily on the games team too, because of the adjustment they had to make there. But the other side of that is I don't think there's an easy parallel that gives full insight to the complex nature of this sport in particular, right? Brian brought up golf and how they cut, half of the field, but also they have more earning opportunities. They get to do that every week. And it's been known for however many years that they've been following that system. And there's a players union and all these things that go behind that. So that it's not necessarily one-to-one. Then Lauren, you bring up the sacrifices and the changes in schedule and things like that. And it's also the parallel he drew was track and field, right? People train 4 years for an Olympic cycle just to run a 100-meter dash or a 800-meter dash, whatever their event is, one time through and they're done. But that analogy also has its faults too, because those people also have their world championships every single year. They have money-making opportunities that fall in line with that exact same level outside of the Olympics that year. And there's a reason why it's called the Olympic champion and not the world champion, because of the qualification structure being different. And also at the same time, if you run the 100-meter dash in the Olympics and get eliminated, you took the entirety of what that test is going to be comprised of. It's not like they're throwing the next round of the 100 meters they're throwing an obstacle in, or now you're running the 400 or a steeplechase. So you can say, hey, I took the full test that everyone else did and I wasn't good enough. And that's ultimately, to me, where that analogy somewhat falls short, because where the CrossFit Games as a whole is just a completely different beast, because the test is so complex, the season is so long, the opportunities are so few, and it's still, despite what people may say, is a very, very young sport. And it's hard to kind of thread the needle or draw a common parallel to other sports as well.
Let me just add this, and then we can move on if we have nothing else to say. But regarding the golf analogy, and this just popped into my head, why that doesn't work is because when you're cutting, let me see if I can explain this. When you cut half the field in golf, right? If you kept that whole field, it doesn't mean that like golfers, what is it, like 37 through whatever, have an opportunity to take points away from the people at the top.
Yes.
You're going against the course, not against each other.
Yeah.
So if I'm in 54th place and I eagle a hole, that does not really affect what's going on top of the leaderboard, because those points are still available. Does that make sense?
They still have an opportunity
to eagle that hole as well. And
yes.
it's not like, well, I got first in that hole, so now you're playing for second.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why, you can make those cuts, because it's just you against the course, not you're not being scored in relation to your golfers, to the fellow golfers with points.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Yeah. And I will say this, of the cut structures that we've seen, this one to me makes the most sense.
Agreed.
That if you just look from a gross number standpoint, 75%
I think
of the field will
last year's too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. 75% of the field takes 75% of the test. That's a much higher number than we have had in years past. So I think if you're going to cut down to 20 and you're going to cut down to 30 in short order, I think this structure makes more sense. I still like last year's, I think, the most, maybe, as far as, because they only went to 30, but and this kind of, maybe we can parlay this into the next conversation. It does also put an emphasis on what your scoring tables are as well. And those just got published.
Oh, they did?
Yeah. They got published on the website.
Are they any different than we've seen in the past?
So and Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, with 40 athlete tables, the same. The 30 athlete and 20 athlete tables are just slight adjustments to the, I think they're towards the bottom of the field. They're off by a single point because they've zeroed out last place. They've made last place worth 0. There's a 5-point difference between 20th place compared to 2021, where last place got 5 points, but they've zeroed it out and made it a 10-point drop for finishing dead last. So if you finish dead last in the test, after the cuts, you get 0, just like dead last at 42. So those are the minor adjustments.
Also, hopefully you get 0 points if you do 0 work.
That's one that should be. That should be. This might go off the rails. But would you be more in favor of cuts, Brian? And I brought this up to Tommy earlier. If they reset the scores after every cut?
Well, I mean,
And
I
I don't
kind
know
of
if I
alluded
support
to
that.
this. I kind of alluded to this last week, and I think that Dave kind of he hinted at it as well. Is that he basically built up the programming, and so we have he has a lot of faith and confidence in the programming this year, and I think he has a lot of faith and confidence. At least it sounded to me that the programming through 2 days of competition is going to be well balanced enough to stand on its own. And I think that should be an ambition of theirs. The challenge for them is going to be Saturday, because we could just take you and I, Sean, and we can say that I'm a good bodyweight athlete and you're a good strength athlete. And if we're straddling the 20 mark line, that's going to be cut at the end of Saturday. And it just so happens that on the 3 tests that come out that day, there's 2 bodyweight and 1 strength test. And on the last day, there's 2 strength tests and 1 bodyweight, that you might just miss it by a fraction. But if one of those tests had switched places, you would have been in and I would have been out. And don't forget that we also now have earning potentials all the way through 40 spots, which means there's money to be fought for at every point on the leaderboard. And 2 years ago, when we cut down to 20 and only 20 people were being paid, that was something that people who were in favor of the cuts or the CrossFit Games team could point to and say, hey, well, we're paying 20 and we're cutting to 20 before this. And there's still every opportunity to fight for those dollars amongst the remaining field. But at this point, money will change hands because of people's missed opportunity. People will make cuts because of Saturday. Even if Thursday, Friday are perfectly balanced, and we can look at them and say, yeah, you pulled this out in isolation, I'll take this test any day and I'll stand by it. You still have to make sure that Saturday is also on its own a good enough test to weed out those last 10, and I can almost guarantee you it won't be.
Yeah, that's tough. It's funny because he did mention something about the idea of athletes needing to earn your right to stay in the test.
That's a total Navy SEAL thing.
That is
that speaks, I think, tremendous, really, to his background, and he's admitted like that influences the way that he approaches things.
Yeah, I mean, and from a big picture perspective, I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Yeah,
but it makes it very difficult to execute it at this level with that many athletes and all the moving pieces and the complex nature of the sport, as I mentioned earlier.
Get rid of quarterfinals, add another in-person stage of competition, take fewer people to the games, 20 people at the end, and straight on till morning.
There you go. There's the season until forever.
Problem solved. Okay, let's get to our
wait, Sean.
Yeah, you want one more thing? Yeah.
Address one other thing, because I thought this was perhaps the most critical thing that he mentioned in the entire 22-minute thing, which is the cut system would have looked a lot different if I wasn't there. And he took direct ownership for that. And I think that is a very big insight into how much influence he actually has on this year's CrossFit Games. And it seems to be more than I think most people were expecting.
Well, and he even said in there too, like everyone freaked out at 2019. He was like, I didn't think it was that bad.
Well,
I'm going
to comment on that one.
Yeah.
Okay. But he did not think that was as controversial as a lot of people did. Am I wrong about that?
Fine. I am going to comment on it. When I presented him with specific data that said, hey, this test was all about the sleds, he pushed back and said, absolutely not. It was a bar muscle up test. And there's no data to support that. That's just a point of view that he's choosing to have, and he's refusing to acknowledge the data to back up anything else.
Yeah. Well, there you go.
And you tell me, Dave Castro, if you happen to listen to this, if you think Matt McLeod was one of the 10 fittest on earth that year and Andy Thorsdottir wasn't, come and talk to me about it.
Cage match, friend Castro at the Salinas County Fairgrounds.
I don't want to. I want nothing to do with that, Dave.
Monster trucks to follow.
That's right. Sunday.
One thing about the scoring tables too. They did not. So the PFAA has a scoring tables article and document that they suggest for events as part of their competition resources. One thing they did note is that if you were going to make cuts, the PFAA recommended an even distribution scoring table for those.
Interesting.
And CrossFit does not use an even distribution scoring table. So I'm curious. This is why I want to know about the discussions and see a little bit about how the sausage gets made. Because I want to know, all right, where are the things that they push back on? Where are the things that CrossFit's willing to listen? Mm-hmm. What is the balance point? So we have a little bit more insight that's not just beyond like someone saying something. You know?
Okay. Last call. Anything else?
I'm trying to think. Went through. Yeah.
All right.
I think that's about it. I mean, I will. What did you think about the impact on? He mentioned like vendors too.
No, I mentioned that. I think like all of that was good. It was good things to consider when doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm just like, just take 20 people then. Take 20 people and make it must-see TV the entire time.
What I would say about that is I think that it was very prudent for Dave to acknowledge the variety of different groups of people who are involved in the CrossFit Games and who could potentially benefit from some of the decisions that they're making. But I also know this about Dave, is that when he acknowledged it himself and has acknowledged it regularly and hinted at it in many other times, that when he's not involved in something, he doesn't pay attention to it at all. And he has not been involved in the CrossFit Games for nearly at least a year and a half. I don't think he's had a lot of conversations with the vendors. I don't think he's had a lot of conversations with the fans. He just had his first conversation with the athletes. I don't think that he has as good of a pulse on all of those things as that the confidence with which he communicated that message necessarily contributes. And I know that he has access to people and resources who could inform him on that. And I do want to acknowledge the possibility that he's pursued some of those in light of some of the comments that he made. But his personal MO is not to be involved if he's not involved, and that if he is involved, he's all in.